Greetings, friends! Wandererska here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of December 22nd through December 31st of 2025. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around. Hope you guys had a wonderful Christmas. I hope you guys are going to have a happy New Year as well, because this is the last day of the year. Technically, this is not the last week. This is like a week and a half, but I just kind of wanted to incorporate just the rest of what happened in 2025 today. So, and we got a lot. We got a lot of Christmas gifts this year, and a lot of big news. So, and we're going to be beginning in the Zaporizhia direction and slash Dnipropetrovsk direction, and we're talking about one of the only one. This is like one big news, one big present. The first big present we're opening this week is that the Russians have completely captured the town of Hulyaipole. We were talking about that this town has been battling since about mid-November. So the battle for the town lasted maybe the end of November. So the battle lasted for a little bit over a month, maybe about a month. But for such a strategic town, this town was like one of the linchpins of Ukrainian defenses, was defending the Zaporizhia direction for years. And because the Russians were able to attack it from the back, they were able to capture Hulyaipole. And the last time we left off is that the Ukrainians were still in control of the central part and this western kind of like industrial zone, and so they had a lot of built up area. So I'm like, how will the Russians crack this? Because so far they've only really captured some of the residential areas. Well, it turns out the Ukrainians defending here fled for their lives because the Russians actually captured a command post somewhere here. And so, completely intact one. So they got a lot of information from that. We also had, just as soon as that happened, we had Russians raising their flags, or not raising their flags, but actually they did raise their flags here, but they had like a Russian troop being here, and then they raised their flags all over this town. I really like how the group of forces east, the eastern grouping here, which is in charge of this direction, and every time they capture a town or a settlement, they show them raising their flag, so it confirms that they actually captured it. So it's a lot of good news. So yeah, the complete capture of Hulyaipole. I mean, it was a matter of time. The Russians already, captured the southern and the northern and the eastern part and was squeezing it, and it seems like the Ukrainians could not even hold on to these high-rise buildings, so they completely lost it. So they lost the entire Hulyaipole area. Along with this, the Russians cleared out a bunch of trenches that are to the south of it. Obviously the former line ran around this, and the Ukrainians were, prepared for a frontal attack. So there's a bunch of trenches here. So the Russians cleared everything behind this highway here, so the trenches that are here. So that was also something. So yeah, the complete capture of Hulyaipole, big news for the Russians, very big. This not only creates a huge bridgehead on the other side of the Gancha River for the Russians, it also creates a huge logistics point and a huge place to accumulate forces. I think right now the Russians are probably pausing. There's probably going to be there's been a lot of snow in this. The winter is now hitting in full force. It seems like, maybe after, the Russians completed a bunch of objectives, and they're not going to let their troops be like resting for their Christmas time, because the Russian Christmas is actually on January 7th, I believe. So I do think that for the next week or so, where there's going to be some accumulation, but they will restart. They won't be like waiting for months. They will restart operations soon enough, and obviously the next goal will be Zaporizhia, and they will attack it, bombard it, and force the Ukrainians out of here. Also probably push northwards, take Zalinia, reach this reservoir right here. So this will be the next Russian goal. Again, because the Russians are going to be attacking from the east here, the Ukrainians don't really have much defenses here. We're expecting a frontal attack here. So I do think that Zaporizhia will probably fall pretty soon as well, sometime in January. And then also probably they'll clear everything behind this rail line right here as well. So after that, it's a very open question. Maybe the Russians will focus northwards here, and kind of combine with what's happening in the north here. And right now, and let's talk about that. Since we're in this direction, is that the Russians are also creating a what I call the Ternavata bridgehead. Right now, the Russian forces from the north and south are crossing the last, basically, major line of defense in the Ukrainian Zaporizhia Oblast. So the Gancha River, which the Russians reached, and was where the Ukrainians built up a bunch of trenches, some strongholds, and this was like if you look at like a fortification map, this is basically the last line of defense. There's some defenses around Zaporizhia, but not very extensive ones. But between Zaporizhia and the Gancha River, which Syriac has with this blue line, this is not the river. This is just a defense line. It shows there's basically no other defenses. The Ukrainians are hastily trying to build a new one between Novomykolaiivka and Orekov right here because there's another river that flows here, a smaller, another small river, but it's not anywhere near complete. It's not as fortified here. So if the Russians break through here and then go through these open steps with almost no fortifications and reach here before the Ukrainians could build this line of defense, then there's nothing stopping them before they reach the outskirts of Zaporizhia city itself. So that's why the creating this bridgehead is a very bad news for the Ukrainians because they're hoping to keep the Russians on the other side of the river, and this is not stop them. They're improving their bridgehead near Dobropillya. Sources are saying they took the village of Kostovka here. I don't think I had any geolocations of this, but a lot of mappers and Russian sources are saying they captured this. So this small village on the very southern part of Ternavata. In the northern part, the Russians are creating the bridgehead between the three villages of Zaporizhia and Gerasimovka here. These are like one-way street villages, so just some buildings and such. What's important here is not just the villages themselves, is that there's a bunch of trenches that the Ukrainians built like right in front of the river because they were trying to use the river as a natural defense. And so it's not just these little villages. There's a bunch of strongholds and trenches that the Russians are occupying here as well. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians continue expanding their northern bridge here, take Borostovka, reach this rail line here, and then start entering Ternavata. So I do think that this will be another thing, along with Zaporizhia, which will be the Russian focus for in the first weeks of 2026. Because once Ternavata falls, so that's what's happening here. And another thing just to mention is also the Russians have taken the town of Andriivka. So the Russians are. It looks like what the Russians are doing is going to be using the Volchka River as their northern defense. And obviously the Ukrainians have two huge cities of Lyquidation and Pokrovsky to accumulate forces to cross the river. And so the Russians are trying to basically use the river as a choke point, so that if the Ukrainians want to attack their northern flank here, their supplies will be across the river. The bridges have been destroyed, so the logistics will be very hard for the Ukrainians. So what they're hoping is that the Volchka River in the north here probably acts as the northern defense. I thought they'd probably advance more, but it seems like the main focus of the Russians will be to attack into Zaporizhia Oblast, which makes sense. They claim Zaporizhia Oblast. They don't really care about the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. I do think that if they want to take the rest of Zaporizhia Oblast, creating a security zone in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, ideally for the Russians, probably between the towns of Porozno and Mozova. So if the Russians could create reach this defense line here, this will give them a solid foothold in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and will also allow them to align their fronts when they take the rest of northern Zaporizhia Oblast as well. So I do think maybe in the future they will advance here, but at the moment they're focusing on Zaporizhia. Alrighty, so and so basically what the Russians will be doing here once they take Ternavata and Zaporizhia is basically destroy the rest of the big Ukrainian towns that they're using as their logistics. So from Ternavata, they'll continue moving towards Donivka. The Russians will probably break through here, try and take Verska, Turiska here, and then just put the clamps on Voza. Man, these villages are really something else. I cannot pronounce these for shit. Anyway, but yeah, the Russians will be basically clearing out this huge defense line and forcing the Ukrainians back to their Orekov, Novomykolaiivka line here. And then the Russians will probably try to burst through and cut this highway, which serves as a logistics point for Orekov here. So that is probably the main goal for the Russians. And so I think how long this will take. It depends how the Ukrainians are sending reinforcements here, so it just depends on how long they could hold the Russians in this line to help try to build as much defenses as they can here. If they could hold the Russians here for a couple of months, maybe 3-4 months, they could probably build up enough defenses where once the Russians reach here, it'll be another haul slog to break through here, so that they could probably save Zaporizhia from being besieged by the end of 2026. If not, then it's actually very much possible that the Russians reach Zaporizhia city sometime in the fall of 2026. It's very much possible. Now, speaking of kind of the Zaporizhia direction itself, kind of this area, we have a lot of, and this is and we're going to talk about what's happening here, because a lot of actually events happening here in the last week and a half, and I'll talk about how this kind of goes along with the other group. So here, this is where the group of forces Dnieper, actually, so this is a different Russian grouping, is operating here, and they're making a lot of rapid progress. So this week, they talked about how the Russians completely captured the town of Stepnohirsk. In the last month or so, we talked about the Russians. It seems like mappers were saying they were encircling it, and the Ukrainians were held up in these high-rise buildings in the center. And so the thing is, the Russians did not release any videos of them raising their flags here. So that gives a question to is this actually under their full control? Now, we did have a bunch of geolocations, for example, of the Russians being in these fields to the south of Leukemia here. And we actually, and this, we have more and more mappers showing that these fields, kind of between Kamyanska, Leukemia, and Stepova. I think for this week we had this amount being taken. They're just continuously pushing through along this. There's a bunch of trenches here, obviously because the front line here has been kind of static for a little bit. So the Ukrainians have built a bunch of trenches. So the Russians are kind of advancing from the west here, and the Ukrainians weren't expecting that, so they were like, they're just digging up all these trenches. Some Russian sources are saying they also took the town of Leukemia, which makes sense, and took the solar power plant here. So this has some industrial zone buildings. So if Stepnohirsk and Leukemia have been taken, I haven't seen any evidence for it just yet, but I do think, it's definitely possible. We had evidence of the Russians being in the southern part of it. We actually had some geolocations of the Russians being right outside, like getting droned right outside on the most eastern part of this citadel here. So it's definitely, it's not, I do think they did take it. But just a bit of an asterisk there that maybe not, but I do think they did. Now, if they did take it, obviously the next goal for the Russians is to take these line of villages here. They will continue moving along these trenches towards the village of Polovka, and try to storm the main defense node here, which is Nova Kulinova here. This is actually on the more higher ground here, and so the Russians could take these string of villages here. They will be able to then, and then kind of like line up their forces with the Russian positions in Malosherbiki and Sherbiki. So the Russians continue advancing in this direction. The next goal for the Russians is to reach the towns of Novopalovka, Yurivka, Novoandreevka, and then cut the highway here. Now, if you look at the bigger picture here, you could see that actually one of the biggest goals for the Russians, which they'll probably try to achieve by the summer, maybe early summer of 2026, is trying to, you could see this big encirclement of Kharkov happening. And so, we talked about how the main goal for the Russians is to break the Ukrainian defenses here and then reach and cut this highway near, and reach, Omelette and so forth. And so, you see the Russians advancing here, and then you see the Russians advancing in this direction and trying to cut. You could see that the Russians are trying to encircle Kharkov on multiple angles here. And then there'll be a giant battle for Kharkov in the probably early summer of 2026. So, obviously, that's probably one of the main goals for the Russians here is to take Kharkov, which is one of the main hurdles against going towards Zaporizhia city. So you can see that this is why probably they've activated in this direction, and they're they don't have to go as fast as the eastern grouping. It is a bit harder for them because they are literally attacking directly towards Ukrainian trench lines, which they've expected, and the eastern grouping here has a lot more easier time, but they have a lot more ground to cover. So, the idea is that they will eventually reach a point where they will encircle Kharkov here. So that is probably the goal for the Russian offensive here in Zaporizhia. Also along this, we had a lot of mappers saying that the town of Primorska has basically fallen, that the entire central and southern part has been taken, and that we had Russian DRG activity reaching the canal here, and they're right in the northern part here. Now, mappers are saying they have not consolidated yet, so it's just Russian sources are just saying that they're operating all over here, which makes sense. They're using these buildings to hide from FPV drones, and reaching this canal allows them to defend their northern flank a lot more. Now the Ukrainians have a bunch of positions in Gorivka, Vasilivka, and so forth, so they could do counterattacks here. So the Russians do need to probably watch out for that. But I do think that's we see the Russians operating more and more in the northern part of Primorska. So we're just waiting for more geolocations and some more confirmation that they've consolidated here and are holding their positions here. Because also the Russians are pushing through from this northern part of Stepnohirsk and taking a lot of these tree lines to the north of it as well, according to a lot of mappers, even neutral mappers. So we now see after the fall of Stepnohirsk, which was kind of the main citadel for the Ukrainians, I do think the Russians will now continue, because they were kind of stuck in Stepnohirsk for a little while there. But now it seems like they're now advancing beyond that. And now the main Russian goal is to take let me restart everything here, is to take everything like this for now. And, maybe this might take a month or two. Maybe they'll be able to reach this by sometime in February or so. Once they do that, then maybe the Russians will continue moving along this canal, which goes into the river here, and maybe start battling for Vasilyansk here. And then from here, they'll probably try to reach Yurivka, Zaporizhia, and such. So, we'll see how that develops for the Russians. Alrighty, that is the Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk direction. Lots of big things happening, and that's just just a huge thing. That's a lot of the fall of Hulyaipole, the fall of Stepnohirsk, a big news. Now we're gonna go to the now I'm recalling the Dobropillya direction. The town of Dobropillya is the next goal for the Russians in this group. This is the group of forces center, and this is the second place where we have a lot of big news this week. And the big news for this part, that's another big Christmas present, is the complete capture and liquidation of the Myrnohrad pocket. The Russians have completely captured the city of Myrnohrad, and we had Russians raising their flags all over here. And now, the question is that, in the places they didn't raise their flag, obviously they don't have to raise their flag in every single building. But for example, they raised their flags around this central part, but this so it's like, well, what about this part right here? We didn't have any flag raising here. There's still Ukrainians here, so there could definitely still be Ukrainians in the basements. But we already talked about last time that the Ukrainian defenses in Myrnohrad have completely collapsed. That a lot of them got liquidated by FABs. A lot of them got captured by prisoners, and a lot of them probably did escape because again, this is not when you get to the front line, it's very fluid. It's very the Russians might have positions in these fake farms, but they're very precarious. In the nighttime or in maybe foggy conditions, especially in groups of like maybe 1 to 3, you could definitely escape through here and reach Ukrainian lines in the fields here. So, it's actually not. There was an encirclement of Myrnohrad, but it was basically like, again, it's very porous. It's especially when the encirclement is very short here. Now, but that being said, we had the Russians raising their flags here, and I do think that the battle for Myrnohrad is over. They have raised their flags, and I do think that just like after they captured Pokrovsk, that maybe there were still some Ukrainians left in the basements because it's such a big city. Myrnohrad had 40,000 people pre-war, Pokrovsk 60,000. This entire agglomeration had 100,000 people. So, there's a lot of people that they could have. There's a lot of places the Ukrainians could hide out, and so it takes a while to clean them all out. But that being said, that the Russians are probably in everywhere here, and they've secured it. So the fall of Myrnohrad officially is there, and the Russians. I mean, that's the big news. The Russians have cleared out the central part of Myrnohrad, and one thing that was funny here is that the Russians actually, for some reason, is being kind of gay. Anyway, it's like when I zoom in, it's like not like improving its like it's shitting itself. It's like it's like I'm watching through a water bubble. That's odd. Anyway, is that the same thing for like Radinsky if I zoom in? Yeah, for some reason it's the same. Okay, let me like reset here. For some reason, there we go. Okay, it just wanted to shit itself for a little. It was too excited. Because I was talking about how in Myrnohrad, when the Russians were raising their flags here, they had like a Santa Claus person doing it. So that was pretty funny. They had a Santa Claus. So it's kind of weird. They were able to bring Santa Claus outfits out to Myrnohrad, have people dress up in it. So that was pretty interesting. Anyway, yeah. So there's that. The liquidation of the Myrnohrad pocket. I do think there's going to be a slowdown in operations here. The Ukraine, the Russians. There'll be some battles for the northern part here, which is more porous than this part. But besides that, I do think that there's going to be a slowdown in operations in the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad direction. But the next goal is the Dobropillya direction. That's why I renamed it here. So there's that. Now, a bit more to the north here, there's a bunch of counterattacks. So here we had, the Russians claimed they took all of Radinsky, but a few days before they announced it, we had the Ukrainians entering Radinsky and trying to storm this building, which was bombed by Russian forces. So I do think Radinsky, and also Radinsky is like really battered and destroyed. Like it got not razed totally to the ground, but like it's very, very much like a big ghost. Like every building probably has some destruction marks on it. So it's very much very destroyed here. Not just totally, but it's very battled for it. And the Russians claim they captured all of it, but it's probably very easy for the Ukrainians to re-enter it if they want to. Same thing for the north here. A lot of pro-Russian mappers are saying the front line goes along this rail line. However, we had a geolocation of the Ukrainians doing a counterattack and trying to enter Zaporizhia before being destroyed. So right now it does seem like this kind of these fields because the Ukrainians have the town of Belitsky, which allows them to accumulate a lot of forces, and then there's not a lot of ground to cover before they enter here. Now, it's a pretty waste of time. There's like not really that much use for it. Maybe the Ukrainians think they could, take a bunch of these fields here, so they always try, but the Russians always hit them back. So there's a lot of back and forth, around Radinsky and Zaporizhia. The Russians a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying they're still in control of this area, but it does show that the front line here is a lot more liquid and porous, if that's the word, than you would expect. So, if the Ukrainians stop attacking, the Russians basically can align their front along this area here, and so we just have to see how this, we just have to get more and more data to see what's the fluid situation around Belitsky here. Now, a bit more to the north here is where the Russians are making more and more progress. We had geolocations of the Russians being in Novoshakhova. A lot of sources are saying that the Russians are, this northern flank here seems to be a lot more secure for the Russians. So, the Russians have taken these tree lines in front of Dorozhezhny, took Novoshakhova and Ivanovka back. Some pro-Russian sources are saying they're actually moving more further north and have captured Vilnia here, and have kind of lined themselves along these like two very clear water lakes here. So this northern part is actually shaping up to be pretty well. It's just I think the thing is the Ukrainians don't really care about this northern flank. They're more concerned with maybe trying to de-blockade Myrnohrad. So that's why they've been doing attacks here. So maybe that's probably the reason. Anyway. So, lots of things happening in this direction, and the liquidation of Myrnohrad, big news for the Russians, another big win for them, another big Christmas present for them. And that's I do think that there'll be some count. I think maybe the Russians will improve a little bit. Maybe they'll continue advancing in Grishny. Maybe align their push the Ukrainians out further from Pokrovsk and kind of align themselves between Grishny and Radinsky here and force the Ukrainians back towards these villages and towns to the south of Dobropillya. Continue trying to push back Ukrainian attempts to break through in this northern part here. And but we shall see how that develops. Anyway, there's a lot of Ukrainian. This is where a lot of Ukrainian troops are. However, after the fall of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, the Ukrainians are pushing them, pulled some units away from here towards the Zaporizhia direction. So we shall see how maybe. But I do think there'll be a slowdown in operations here since the Russians have completed their mission taking Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Slavyansk direction, and there's actually been no changes in the Konstantinovka direction, actually, surprisingly. So there's been no changes here. So yeah, so we're going to go directly back to the Slavyansk direction here, the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk direction. A lot of interesting things have happened actually in this direction. The Russians are making more progress here than we've seen in a big while. One of the biggest news, which I found very surprising, is the Russians have completely taken all these trenches and these like hills that are So there's a river right here, so there's a low ground here. So as you go further north, you get more and more to a higher elevation, and so the Ukrainians built a bunch of trenches here to using the river as a defense. But with the fall of Swatopokrivsky and the Russians pushing through here, it seems like the Russians have taken this entire area right here. Let me all these fields to the south of Swatopokrivsky and Pazania here has been captured by Russian forces. So very big news for so a lot of the Russians are rapidly moving here. They're probably also are taking this set of trenches here as well. We talked about how the fall of Veselivska is because the Russians took the trenches that are in the high ground here. So the Russians a lot of sources are saying the Russians are continuously moving up along these trenches and are about to finish the battle for Bradarnia here. And so a lot of rapid progress here. The Russians are pushing out from the river here and rapidly taking more and more fields and villages here. The main goal here is Ray Alexandrivka and reaching the Seversky Canal here, because this is the high ground position. This is kind of like, once they reach here, they'll have the dominant high ground. They'll be overlooking Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and they'll be close enough where they could bring drone units to start droning, the approaches to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and start harassing it. So that's why they're just trying to get up close to Slavyansk Kramatorsk. I don't think they'll be doing a direct attack because the Ukrainians are expecting a direct attack. I do think that they're just going to maybe reach the Ray Alexandrivka, Mykolaiivka line and the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal here. Once they reach here, they'll be able to start droning, and they have the high ground and such. Along with this, a bit more to the north here, we had the Russians. We had actually a geolocation of the Russians being in the center of Zakitna here, and so now just this kind of this little hill and the rest of the western part of Zakitna is being fought over. I think once the Ukrainians are completely kicked out of Voronezh and such, the Russians will be able to then clear these hills and these hills around Zakitna and fully capture the rest of this village here. And then the main goal here, obviously, as we saw here, is the Russians reaching the Kirilovka and Kalinivka line, which will be the forward operating bases for the last big effort towards the main objectives, which is, as I mentioned before, Rail, Alexandrivka, and Mykolaievka here. Along with this, we had the Russians are continuously moving along these trenches here, trying to capture more and more of these trenches in these areas here, and have entered the eastern part of Rizivka here. Now, Rizivka kind of is like this long village that kind of enters into Kalinivka here. Is like one elongated village here. So, the Russians will just continue advancing along these tree lines here. And again, are battling for Zakitna here, so once they capture it, they'll be just using the hills to advance towards Kirilovka, and the main goal is to take everything in this area behind the Seversky Donetsk River and everything here. So once the Russians capture this, they'll be in a very good position. They'll be in a more higher elevation, because Seversk is actually on a very low ground, and Seversk could act as a logistics center, so it'll be very good for the Russians here. A bit more to the south here, the Russians have activated here. Most mappers are now saying the Russians have completely captured the village of Novomarkova because they are now advancing a lot, capturing a lot of these tree lines. Some Russian sources are saying the battle for this Makivka defense line here in Prolievka, Golubka, Makivka here is ongoing. Oh yeah, we also had. Did I mention this? Oh yeah, we also had the Russians capture a bunch of these tree lines that are right before the front line kind of went from along this reservoir here. So the Russians have also captured a bunch of these tree lines to the south, to the north of Zaporizhia here. So the Russians are also activating here, and now the main defense for the Ukrainians is in the Makivka, Golubivka, Prolievka villages here. This is where the front line's been static here since the fall of Bakhmut in 2023. So the Ukrainians have had over 2.5 years to build defenses here. So these are there's a lot of trenches here, but it seems like the Russians don't care. We had a month ago the Ukrainians blowing up a dam here to slow down the Russians. So it seems like the Russians are making a lot of progress here, or at least they're they're threatening this. Now, I do think the Russians will try to take these 3 villages, line themselves along the canal. And so, we saw, this is where, the Russians are making a lot of bombardments here, a lot of strikes here, so it does seem like this is another area the Russians want to attack towards. Because again, if they can move along the canal and they'll continue moving, they're just slowly but surely putting the squeeze on Ray Alexandrivka here. So just slowly but surely they're doing that. And yeah, that's the Slavyansk direction. A lot of rapid progress, mostly in the fields. It's not sexy, but it is necessary to continue their advancements because that is what the Russians need to do as they reach Ray Alexandrivka and Mykolaievka here. So that is going to be where the Russians will be focusing on for 2026. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Lyman direction. In the Lyman direction, we had a lot of interesting geolocations in this direction. Now, the biggest news is that, according to the Russians, is that they completely captured the town of Dobropillya here. We don't have any geolocations here. We've had geolocation. I mean, obviously, it's not out of the question. It's not like, oh, this is impossible. But we, we have the Russians claim they take Dobropillya. We had geolocation of the Russians being along this highway, for example. So it's not out of the question the Russians could have taken Dobropillya. The question is that, how come they haven't taken Voronezh yet? So, but I do think they'll probably announce the capture of Voronezh probably within a few days. So then, once the Russians take Voronezh and Dobropillya, this will, again, help the Russians in the southern part, but also it helps secure their southern approaches to Lyman. And that's very important because we actually had geolocation of the Russians being right in the center part of Lyman in this, mailbox right here. So, as we saw before, we had, there's a huge, this is very liquid. It doesn't seem like there's actually any Ukrainian defenses in the, so Lyman's split in half by the rail line here. So there's a bunch of high-rise buildings here, which I think the Ukrainians are using as a big defense. But in the northern part of this rail line, there's a bunch of residential areas, and I don't think the Ukrainians actually have positions here. And so I do think the Russians actually have a pretty easy time to enter this residential area. The only problem is that their logistics is pretty bad, and that's actually why they're doing all these battles to encircle Lyman, because they want to have better logistics here. So, we actually, so it depends on, like, if the Russians, if that was just DRG activity or if they're able to consolidate. So it's just a big question. But it's definitely, I do think this northern part of Lyman with residential areas will be taken pretty easily once the Russians have the requisite, have done the requisite encirclements here. Now, in the northern part, there's been no real big changes here. One of the biggest changes, another big kind of big Christmas surprise almost, was that we actually had geolocation of the Russians being in Suntsova. This is a rail line here. This is a small little village here, but that we had geolocation of the Russians being here, and the capture of it was or not capture of it, but the way the geolocation worked is that the Ukrainians were doing a counterattack towards Suntsovka and in Urarova around this area. So the Ukrainians were attacking. Now, we don't know if the Ukrainians were kicked the Russians out of here, or they destroyed them, or they just attacked and withdrew. But it does show that the Russians are in these fields here. So it just showed that the Russian positions in these fields is probably confirmed. So the fact the Russians were in Suntsova is a very bad news for the Ukrainians here. So it does seem like the Russians are actually advancing very rapidly along this area here. So we shall see how that develops. Maybe the Russians got kicked out of Suntsova, but it does show that the Russians in this area are a lot more expansive than we might previously have thought. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kupyansk-Kharkov direction. The last direction for this week. And the biggest news, this is now for another big news here. This is something good for the Ukrainians, however, is that it seems like the Russian defenses in Kupyansk have completely collapsed. Now, towards the end of this week, so in the last 3 or 4 days, we've had some geolocations showing that the Russians are in a more better position in Kupyansk than we thought. I thought Kupyansk was done for. I thought the Ukrainians completely kicked the Russians out of Kupyansk, but that is actually not the case. It seems like the Russians still have positions in kind of the central part right here. So this kind of central part right here is still under Russian control. But it seems like the Ukrainians have captured, the entire southern part of Kupyansk, the northern part of Kupyansk. That being said, there's actually been some geolocation of the Russians operating in this most northern section. They actually had they released some video showing themselves here. We had another video. It seems like they used some sort of tunnel operation to escape themselves from Moskovka here. So it seems like the Russians have the ability to enter Moskovka here. So it seems like, and also obviously the Russians also send a video out of them being in the bakery that's around here. So it does, before it seemed like it seems like the Ukrainians were doing a bunch of these counterattacks that were about to destroy the entire Russian position here. And not only that, I thought at least the Russians would hold on to the eastern part of Kupyansk, but it seemed like the Ukrainians did some sort of attack that took one of the best defensive positions here, the stronghold of the bakery. But it seems like the Russians retook it, so it seems like their position in the eastern part is a bit more secure. But the western part is still very precarious. Maybe they're able to hold. I still think the Ukrainians will liquidate this western part of Kupyansk, but it seems like the Russians are sending reinforcements to try to hold on more and more here. So it's just a big question on how much more can the Russians hold on here. So it's not over with the Russians. The Russians are still in Kupyansk, but it's very much it just depends on how much longer they can hold out. We have to see what's going to happen in January. But I do think that this western part of Kupyansk is basically over. But who knows? Maybe the Russians have surged reinforcements and are able to knock the Ukrainians out. We shall see. But yeah, the Ukrainians are making lots of progress in retaking Kupyansk, but the Russians are holding on. So we shall see if that was just a delaying tactic or if that's something that allows them to hold on to Kupyansk, even just parts of it. Now, in the Kharkov direction, a little bit more here, the Russians have taken a bunch of these fields between Dobropillya and Kamyanka, this area right here. It was probably just empty fields. I don't think there was actually any Russian troops or Ukrainian troops here. It was just, just improving their positions here. The main Ukrainian defenses is along these string of villages along the river here. So if the Russians, this is where the Ukrainians are settled, so it makes sense that the Russians are able to take more of these fields here. So the big question is if the Russians are able to attack and take some of these towns here, which are probably actually defended. So we shall see. But some field actions in the fields in the Kharkov direction. Now, a bit more towards the actual main area in Volchansk. The biggest news from here is the complete capture of the town of Vilcha. Here we have the Russians raising their flags here. They also have announced they have completely captured the town of Perlivka here, this small village right here, and are now clearing this kind of forest between Lyman and Perlivka here, which makes sense. So some small changes here. The Russians are also advancing more and more towards Volchansky Kurovka here. Just some very small gains here, but they're slowly but surely entering this town. So the Russians will probably take this sometime in January, and probably one of the things the Russians will also take here is the towns of Harovska and Sinivka here. Probably, take these two villages. Right now, the Ukrainians are still holding on here, but I do think the Russians will take these two villages sometime in January as well. And but I do think that since after they take Volchansk, they're not going to just slow down and just improve the peripheral defenses around Volchansk. But I don't think they're going to some sources are saying they're going to try to go towards Belya-Kolodasky here, but I do think there's a lot of fields here. It's going to take a lot of drones that they might get hit for. My theory is that the Russians are just going to move down along the Sovietsky Donetsk River and take more of these villages here. Take like these villages right here, and then from here, just slowly do a slow, attack towards Belya-Kolodasky here. But I don't rule out the Russians to do a Leroy Jenkins moment and just try to enter Belya-Kolodasky and just say fuck it, because sometimes that has happened. And there's been no changes in there's been no changes in the Sumy direction. And alrighty, that is it for this 2025. That's what's happened. I hope you guys have a wonderful New Year's Eve. I hope you guys had a wonderful Christmas. If you guys are Russian or Eastern Orthodox or whatever, I hope you guys enjoy your Christmas coming up on January 7th. So, hope you guys enjoy. Be sure to subscribe to this channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.